Foreign Secretary, but even someone like Boris Johnson, 2 years ago I think it was, on a visit to Israel and the Palestinian territories, said, he used the A word, the apartheid word, he said, without a two-state solution, if Israel remains in the West Bank, this will be an apartheid situation. He's echoing very similar language to that was used by US Secretary of State John Kerry, and even by someone like former Israeli Prime Minister and a war criminal, Ehud Barak, who said, again, without a two-state solution, there will be an apartheid situation here. But notice that what they're describing is now. What they're describing is the status quo. Oh, if Israel was to maintain the West Bank, if Israel was to control millions of Palestinians who don't have the vote and don't have any rights, etc., then it would be an apartheid situation. But that's the apartheid present. And that's been the apartheid present for half a century with respect to the military regime in the occupied territories. But because the peace process has offered this idea that at some point there will be a two-state solution, that has served to sort of project or displace the apartheid now into an apartheid future. So before I move into what I promise is a more optimistic section, I also just wanted to make one point clear. And I don't know how often you talk about this topic with people you know, but one thing that comes up a lot when talking about Israel and the Palestinians is why there hasn't been a peace agreement so far, or what is the main block to there being any progress in the peace process. And to my mind, there is a very simple core reason for that impasse that exists today. And that is that the maximum that's on offer from Israel has never and isn't anywhere near the minimum that the Palestinians can accept, or indeed the standards of international law. And that applies for every single Israeli government that is engaged with the so-called peace process. And as of today, there are only really 3 tracks or approaches on offer from the Israeli political mainstream vis-a-vis the Palestinians. Track 1, or approach 1, is the status quo. Just keep the status quo going for as long as you can. And I think personally that Benjamin Netanyahu is within that camp as a person. Okay? The status quo is beneficial for Israel, minimal cost, just keep it going. The second approach, which has grown in prominence in recent years, says that actually Israel can and would be able to, should, annex formally parts or even all of the West Bank. And that approach is represented by Jewish Home, the party, elements within Likud too, and so on. And the other approach, which dominates the current Israeli opposition parties, is separation. And it's sometimes presented as being a two-state solution or a Palestinian state. But when you drill down the details, that plan being offered by Israel's current mainstream opposition is not a recipe or a program for genuine Palestinian self-determination or sovereignty. It's more like a program for a Bantustan. And they talk about separation primarily, not about Palestinian sovereignty or independence. So you've got status quo, annexation, or separation. And that, unfortunately, is what's on the menu with respect to either this Israeli government or any plausible Israeli government that might follow it. So that's my sort of summary of the first part of the book that looks at the grim status quo on the ground and how and why there is an impasse with respect to the peace process and no likely prospect of a shift anytime soon. But the second part of the book shifts to what are the cracks in the wall of the title. The cracks in the wall, of which I focus on 3, are those cracks in Israel's traditional pillars of support that I believe over time will make it, in association with other factors, difficult or perhaps impossible for Israel to maintain this apartheid status quo. The first crack in the wall that I talk about in the book is the growing fragmentation and divisions within the American Jewish community over Israel, the Palestinians, and even Zionism itself. It's a generational shift, which is attested to in numerous polls over the years. Attitudes do not change as Jewish Americans get older. Okay? There is a definite, they do not change sort of to revert back to being pro-Israel. And there are numerous ways in which you can sort of notice this phenomenon. So for example, one kind of version of this fragmentation is an organization like J Street, which was set up in the sort of Washington DC Beltway lobby mode as a counterpoint actually to AIPAC. But J Street also defines itself as being a pro-Israel organization, defines itself as being Zionist in the sense that it wishes to see Israel remain a quote-unquote Jewish state, but takes issue with the way that AIPAC has supported Israel's right-wing governments, and J Street have tended towards that alignment with that pro-separation camp that I referred to within Israeli politics. But it's still a significant development within these fragmentations. A different kind of example, and one that, in my opinion, is a much more encouraging development, is the emergence of a group like Jewish Voice for Peace, JVP, which is a membership of tens of thousands of people, is a much more grassroots-focused organization, membership-driven organization. There's chapters all across the US, and it's very much focused on activism. It has, in recent years, fully embraced and supported the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. It makes alliances with a lot of different groups, including in the context of fighting back against Trump's anti-migrant and Islamophobic agenda and politics and so forth. So you have those sorts of examples that exist. And I'm not going to sort of go into a lot of detail about all the polling and stuff, because I don't think that would be particularly riveting or entertaining for a talk. But park that thought, because I'm now going to talk about a second crack in the wall, and then read out a little anecdote that I think encompasses or relates to both of these. So you've got the first crack in the wall, which is this growing level of dissent and opposition, often generational, amongst American Jews to what Israel's doing and how it's treating the Palestinians. The second crack in the wall that I talk about is the way in which, again in the US context, there is growing grassroots Democratic Party opposition to what Israel's doing and support for the Palestinians. And it's leading, and you start to see it at the top level a little bit, but it's pushing the US towards an end of this bipartisan era of support for Israel. It wasn't that long ago, really, that you could safely talk about rock-solid bipartisan support, Democrat and Republican, for Israel. But for differing reasons, this is now starting to not look so solid. For example, even on Capitol Hill, you will now find Democratic congresspersons and senators expressing support for something like Palestinian children in military detention. But the gap starts to become even more obvious when you look at the grassroots level polling and membership, or something like the phenomenon of the Bernie Sanders candidacy. Okay, Bernie Sanders, who talked about the Palestinians in Israel, certainly in not a radical way. I mean, he distanced himself, for example, from something like the BDS campaign. But he certainly talked about the Palestinians in Israel in a way that up until that point, no other plausible Democratic candidate has talked, and certainly not in the same way that Hillary Clinton talked about Israel and the Palestinians. And indeed, in recent months, Bernie Sanders has published on his social media accounts a number of different videos expressing support for the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip in the face of the lethal violence being used against them in the Great March of Return protests. Just to give you an idea of the polling issue, so here's one example. So this is in 2017, in February 2017. The results of a national poll by YouGov were published, in which American adults were asked to rate whether a country was an ally or enemy of the US on a 5-point scale. Now, overall, Israel dropped to 16th from 6th between 2014 and 2017, which is an interesting enough development itself, but even more striking was the vast disparity between Republicans and Democrats, who placed Israel 5th and 28th, respectively. Okay, so Republicans saw Israel as the US's 5th strongest ally, Democrats only placed Israel 28th. And there's a lot of polls that show the disparity amongst the sort of the average Democrat and the average Republican. Now, part of that polarization is also led from the right as well, where you find a Republican Party increasingly dominated and driven by the Christian right, which includes a big body of support for Israel, and of course the alt-right, or just the far right, which is also, of course, part of Trump's base too. Now, I've mentioned that in the US context, you will also find this replicated in other places, including in Europe, including in this country, where not just the left, but liberals or central progressives are increasingly alienated from what they see as an aggressive ethno-state in the form of Israel, and with increasing solidarity with what the Palestinians are doing. Meanwhile, on the right, and especially the far right, you see a growing expression of support for Israel, but kind of on for the same reasons, basically. So this is the second crack in the wall that I talk about, because although, in the meantime, for now at least, Israel can look to a Trump White House as being a real bedrock of support. I'm not going to get into the details of what the peace plan might be, but if people want to talk about that in the Q&A, feel free. But certainly Israel feels, confident, with good reason, that the current US administration is not going to be proposing anything that really calls for any serious concessions by Israel. So on the one hand, that looks good from Israel's point of view, but what I argue is that actually in the medium to long term, what seem like gains or positive developments now actually don't necessarily bode well for Israel, because actually Israel has benefited significantly from the fact that as an issue, it's been a bipartisan issue in US politics. And for that to shift, Trump won't always be in the White House, the Republicans won't always have control of the White House and so on. You're going to end up at some point with a Democrat president, and if that is a Democrat president that has reflected more of the views of the grassroots, you could well be starting to see the kinds of shifts in US policy that have always been assumed to be impossible or completely far off. So those are two cracks in the wall that I focus on: the developments in the Jewish community, the developments between Democrats and Republicans and sort of progressives and the far right in general. One microcosm that I gave of that in the book, which I'll just touch upon briefly, was the nomination by Donald Trump of David Friedman to the position of US ambassador to Israel, which he of course